So I want to talk a little bit about pushy horses. We tend to approach those as a behavioral issue exclusively. And what I would like to talk about is the postural ramifications for a pushy horse. As you know, form follows function, and every change in a horse's behavior or a habit in a horse's behavior is going to have a change in their posture. One of the most common things that I notice in pushy horses is that they are unconfident, they are generally pretty unhappy, but most of them are fairly tight and locked up in the front end, from the poll, the jaw, the neck, the shoulders, and the back. And I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about what I frequently see and why. And I have here a little orphan colt. He's a little bit on the pushy side, and we see him in some pretty typical ways that a pushy horse tends to be, is he's fairly unconfident and doesn't get along well with other horses very easily because he doesn't read body language very easily. And he's doing significantly better, but he tends to be on the pushy side. And so what I'm gonna do is walk through what those postural changes tend to be and why they matter so much. So kind of starting from the front, pushy horses tends to push with their head a lot, as you can see him doing right now. You know, it's pretty mild, I would say. It's not terrible pushing, but it comes with postural ramifications. When he pushes with his head, he's going to bring his head downward like so, which is going to lock up the poll joint, and he's going to push downward into whatever he's pushing on, with like a person or another horse or whatever you might have. And what that does is it locks up his poll joint. So the more he does that, the tighter his neck and poll and jaw get. And what you can see with this type of horse, I'll turn him to the side so you can see his neck, is these kinds of horses, let's go backward one step, they tend to move their neck as a unit instead of individually by each individual vertebrae. So if I ask him to turn his head, his whole neck and head come, instead of bringing the poll. See how hard it is for him to bring his poll? What you would want to see is that a horse bring the skull and then one vertebrae so that they make a nice bend. And if you see him struggle, you can see how tight his poll is, and he's only 3. So it's quite young to have so much tension in a horse's poll. And what we want to see from a healthy neck and poll is that the head can move freely side to side. And you can see how much of a struggle that is for 2 reasons. For one, he's really tight, and for 2, he's really not used to moving softly in relation to a person. He's used to pushing into, as you can see by hand here, he's used to pushing into that field and avoiding it. So there's always 2 components. There's behavioral component and habit, which is to push. And this is pretty typical of a pushy horse, is that their head is kind of almost like a weapon. You know, they're not used to using their head in a fluid and soft way. They're used to using their head like this horse is doing, where it pushes into stuff. So what we'd like to see is that his head just moves softly side to side because the poll joint is free. So I can help him a little bit by loosening his jaw, and you can see that now we have slightly better flexion side to side. So that is the first way that I most frequently notice horses that are pushy develop poor postural habits. And that's going to make it really difficult for him when it comes to steering, when it comes to leading, when it comes to lunging. If he doesn't understand how to separate the poll joint from the rest of his neck, he's going to be unbalanced by nature under saddle. He's going to move his whole head and neck as a unit and weight his shoulders excessively. And that brings me to my next point, which is when a horse is pushy, they tend to push into their shoulders. You can see when he's walking forward. I'll move him backwards so you can see him a little bit better. But you can see that this horse's weight is dropped into his shoulders here, and he's kind of leaning into his chest most of the time. So that means that something simple like backing him is going to be more difficult than it needs to be. Or turning him away from me is going to be more difficult than it needs to be. So I'll move him away. All right, so see how this shoulder comes almost toward me like it's a magnet. He's got all his weight in this shoulder. His neck is against his chest on this side. So this brachiocephalic muscle here is essentially loaded into the shoulder, ready to push. So the first step that he takes, this shoulder is going to go in. So if I ask him to step forward, you'll see that shoulder goes this way instead of straight. And for comparison, I'll show you what it looks like when it goes straight. And you can see this muscle is overly active, the brachiocephalic muscle, which is responsible for lifting the head. And horses that are pushy, they get a lot of practice using that shoulder and that underneck muscle to push. And what you practice is what you develop muscularly, and so he's going to struggle to engage his top line to move in an effective way because his top line is underdeveloped and his underneck is overdeveloped. So what it would look like if his underneck were not being used, for him to walk forward, I'm deactivating that muscle because I don't think I can walk forward like that. There. See, now it goes straight instead of in toward me. So that's extremely difficult for him, which means that under saddle, if I need to move his shoulder away from the inside of a circle to create better bend, he's not going to be able to do that easily. So he's going to struggle more than a horse who is not pushy, and it really puts him at an unfair disadvantage for all of these things that would make him better prepared for riding life. The other thing that we frequently see is a dropped mid-back. So I'm going to bring him over here so you can see him. You can see how difficult it is to maneuver his front end. And it's not from disobedience, it's not because he's bad, it's not because of any of those qualities, it's simply because his habits have set him up to fail when it comes to those patterns. So here we have his withers and his spine mid-back is dropped somewhat. Again, this horse is only 3, so it's not extremely problematic yet, but it certainly, if it continues down this path, will be. And you can see what happens when I lift his mid-back. See how his underneck disengages and his neck gets longer, his head drops down. I think I might be in the way. I'll let it drop again and do that again. So what I'm doing is lifting his abdomen, and that lifts his mid-back. This is what his back could look like, I know, buddy, if his shoulders weren't always weighted. And he says, wow, that feels weird to me, because he's not really used to that type of feeling. So this horse is going to struggle to go straight. This horse is going to struggle to keep his weight off his forehand. This horse is going to struggle to move his pole joint freely. He's going to struggle with things like bend. He's going to struggle with things like steering. He's going to struggle with just the basic tasks of simple riding until we can get these things sorted out. So until those things are sorted out, I really don't think it's fair to ask a horse to do those things because it's just setting him up to fail, and it's just one more thing for him to get in trouble for. If I didn't understand those habits and those postures, if I said, you know, with my inside rein to bend and my inside leg to move his shoulders over, and he could not do that, that would set him up for excess pressure in those moments. And it just further degrades his confidence, which he already does not have much confidence. So some things that can really be helpful, for one, is putting him out with a herd that is healthy and works the way that a herd should, where horses are moving each other around. They have rules that are consistent and they make sense. They don't allow him to move them. Other horses don't allow him to move them. That will make my job certainly much easier. And then working on loosening his pole, working on loosening his neck, working on going over poles, all of those things can make a big difference. And then being extremely consistent in how I handle him. So I'm not going to, for example, feed him treats out of my hand one day and then the next day be upset that he's checking my pockets for treats, because that really sets him up to fail. And then posturally, I'm going to be very picky about how this horse moves to help him develop new habits. And I'm going to try not to, put excess pressure on him, but I really do want him to understand that there are better and healthier ways for him to move. So I'm going to take this horse through some simple exercises to help him loosen up, to help him understand how he should move, and to see if there are any changes in his behavior as well as his posture. So the first thing that I'm going to do is send him over some poles. And the goal of going over the poles is to give him a place to go that isn't on top of me, to give him a place to think about going straight, to get both shoulders mobilized freely out in front of him instead of underneath his body, because a horse who is pushy tends to have their shoulders very weighted, ready to move into you. And then I'm going to see if it frees up his neck a little bit, because the goal would be to have his neck drop down and forward. So we'll take a look at it. So before I go over these poles, I'm going to get him nice and straight. And we'll go over. Perfect. His neck is dropping down. And I'd like to see a steady forward rhythm. So a horse like this is very likely to kind of spin onto their forehand, so we're trying to avoid that. Very nice. His neck is dropping down. His back is relaxing. He's staying pretty straight. He's staying away from me. Those are very good things. And the bottom of his neck is relaxing. Shoulders are able to move forward. I really like with pushy horses, instead of constantly fighting them off of you, I like to give them some place to go. Because the reason they're on top of you is that's what they know. They don't know where else to go. They wouldn't do that if they didn't know, if they knew something better. And so instead of me constantly battling them and where they are, and you know, it turns into this like big battle of no's. Don't go there, don't go there, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. And they already lack confidence severely, and so I don't want to exacerbate that. I just want to, obviously I'm not going to let that horse step on my toes or run me over, but by giving them a place to go and a task to do, it can really help, because they are doing what they know. They're doing what they're set up to do. They're not misbehaving. They're doing what has been taught to them, either by you by accident or someone else. It really doesn't matter who did it. Now that it's lead rope is in your hands, it's our responsibility. And I love that I can pet his face right now without him pushing all over me, and that's just lovely. When he's pushy, he's not confident. He can't receive my praise and affection the way that he should, and so when he's still and when he's calm, that praise and affection can feel good to him. Let's go the other way. So also with a pushy horse, I'm not going to mindlessly change directions. In fact, I'm not going to really ever make any movement without intention. So when I change directions here, I'm going to do a turn on the haunch. And that means that his hindquarters are going to stay still, and I'm going to move his front end away from me. So the more I move a horse's shoulders away from me, especially a pushy one, the better. Because I'm adding more mobility to them. I'm getting him comfortable and used to the idea of being able to move away from me, which an unconfident horse and a pushy horse is not used to that. So I'm going to try to always move with intention. So I'm going to move his forehand away very slowly. Good man. Now I'm going to go the other direction. Again, I've got someplace for him to go. His neck is dropping down. This is posture that I'd like to see under saddle. Moving through the whole body as a unit. We've really got to bring those shoulders out in front of him in order to make it over these poles. They're set just slightly farther apart than I would normally do. And what you'll also notice with this type of work is that the horse's jaw will start to release. I'm not sure if they were noticeable on camera or not, but he's had a couple lick and chews. His jaw is loosening. We'll come over here and have a sit. Notice how he isn't pushing on top of me nearly as much. He's not leaning into his chest quite as much. wants to move, so we'll just reorganize. And now we're going to check out and see how his pole feels after that work. See if it feels any different. See if I can't move his head to one side. That's much better. And to the other. Still a little creaky, but not nearly. There's a jaw loosening, like that. Let's see if we can move his head to the right. Much better. And head to the left. Ooh, that was much better. So those are just some really simple things you can do. They make a profound change because when the horse's muscular system is all going straight in the same direction, they have to lengthen those muscle fibers, and what creates all of that tension in the joints is just all this contraction that can't be opened up. And the last thing I'm going to do is just help him rearrange his posture here and ask him to stand like that. So I'm going to ask him to start to get comfortable with standing next to me with both shoulders upright, whereas a second ago he stopped kind of into me. So he just took a nice breath out. He thinks he needs to come back over here, but I'm just going to encourage him to start to think about getting comfortable just standing like this, where both his front feet are square, both his shoulders are upright. And now, I don't know if you can see, I'll turn him sideways so you can see. Instead of having this bottom of his neck glued against the shoulder, I think we need to move him a little. There. Now the base of his neck is away from his shoulder. So if he needs to come forward, this left front leg is going to come straight, whereas before it came in. So these are all very small details that you can change to help your horse recover from the postural ramifications of being pushy. Here's the same horse when he first came a few months ago. This is the first day that I worked with him. You can see that his whole body is sort of like a board. He pivots around his left shoulder, swings his hips around, and sort of dives into his head. Doesn't seem to have a concept for how to move his body as a united unit, and moving away from somebody is especially troublesome. So he's very upset and worried, and you can see him place all that weight back into his inside shoulder, into his head. So this session I was mainly focusing on just kind of getting him the basic building blocks of being able to move away and around on a circle, and just sort of assessing him. And I found that this was just about at the level that he could tolerate. This was his threshold, was he felt that moving away from somebody was going to cause him so much distress that he couldn't handle it. So I just thought it would be interesting to include the first session in the way that he moved and compare it to how he's moving now, so you can see how deeply pushy behavior affects their posture, and how important it is to be able to move a horse's body not only away from you but towards you, and to have them operate independently in different parts of their body so that the body can operate as a unit. Because if he can't move his shoulders, if he can't move his neck, if he can't move his pole, then you get this pivoting like a board kind of movement. And to further drive home that comparison, here's again his movement today versus the first day. His body is much more united. His hind feet are tracking up in the line of the front feet. His body seems to work as a unit much better, and he looks overall much more relaxed. Whereas before he was pivoting around the inside front foot with a really stiff neck, and his hindquarters were acting sort of like a rudder. He was upset, he was nervous, he didn't know how to move away from me, and he also didn't know what to expect. And now you can see much nicer patterns of movement. And though we still have some more work to go, I thought it was interesting just to include a comparison of the first day versus now. And I think those are several months apart. I think they're actually 2 months apart. So behavioral patterns and postural patterns are very closely related, and they tend to reinforce each other. So it's important to always address both aspects.